Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anastasia Kinigopoulo, and I'm the director and curator of the Horseman Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri. Our mission is to expand scholarship and appreciation of American art, particularly works by artists who have been historically omitted from the canon due to their race, gender, or geographic locale. For those of you joining us from around the country who might not be familiar with St. Louis, the Horseman Foundation and our premises are located on the traditional lands of the Osage Nation, the Missouri, and the Illini Confederacy, who have stewarded this land for generations. The foundation actively strives to center the living history of Indigenous peoples and to celebrate their historic and ongoing contributions to this region. I'm very excited to have you all here today for our very first artist talk with my wonderful guest, Norman Akers. This is the first in a series of talks we'll be doing in conjunction with our online exhibition, Traditions and Transformations, Modern and Contemporary Native Visions from the Horseman Collection, which is on view on our website, thehorsemanfoundation.org. I'm just going to briefly introduce Norman before we get started. Norman Akers creates paintings that function like cartographic depictions of memory, culture, and place. His work frequently addresses pressing issues of removal, disturbance, and the struggle to reclaim cultural context, and explores notions of mythology, history, and personal experience encapsulated in the concept of sense of place. Born and raised in Fairfax, Oklahoma, he is a citizen of the Osage Nation, Gray Horse District. He received his BFA in painting from the Kansas City Art Institute in 1982 and a certificate in museum studies from the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1983. He received an MFA in fine arts from the School of Art and Design at the University of Illinois Champaign. His work is currently on view in a solo exhibition at the Albrecht Kemper Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. In addition, he has participated in numerous group shows, including Unsettling, a story of land removal and resistance at the Massillon Museum in Ohio, and Art Along the Rivers, a bicentennial celebration at the St. Louis Art Museum, just to name a few. His work is in several collections, including that of the Forge Project Gochman Family Collection, the Gilcrease Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, the Nelson Atkins Museum, and the Hurd Museum in Phoenix, Arizona. Norman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm gonna hand our screen over to you.
Okay. Here we are. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to attend this event. One of the things I'd like to kind of share with you this afternoon is a little bit of my history and my sort of relationship to painting. And when I first sort of visited with Anastasia about this particular talk, I had mentioned that I had been doing printmaking for the last probably 10 years. And I had been really kind of talking about the prints more so. And I wanted to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about painting, today. And also talk a little bit kind of about that history of painting in my own creative work. But always I'd like to kind of start off with providing kind of a context, for who I am, and my work. And this image that you're seeing here is of Osage land up along the border of Oklahoma and Kansas. And part of why I like to show this image is it's really sort of a special place for me. Growing up in the Western Osage, this type of environment, the grassland and the southern tip of the Flint Hills, has just been, I've always had a strong connection to. And hopefully as this talk sort of plays out, you'll begin to start to see kind of how this particular landscape has influenced my work, over the years. One of the things I'd like to kind of mention about this is that, clearly you see the sky, you see the earth and the grassland, and you see this sort of expanse of deep space. And it's that deep space that really sort of intrigues me because, when I can remember as a kid, I would spend a lot of time kind of out in the prairie. And uh, what always amazed me about it is that distance you could only see so far, and beyond your physical eyesight. And likewise too, is if you've ever waded through grass, you realize that there's a lot of things that are so close to you that you can't see as well. So the whole notion of the unknown, has always been sort of important, in my work. And also I tend to think of this type of a landscape as kind of a scape where things can happen. And I think that might be a good intro to move into the next painting. Um, I'm going to show some things a little bit out of order just to kind of provide a better understanding of my work. But this is a painting called Sorting Out Blind Sensations. And this was done in the late 90s. And it was kind of a return to figurative painting for me. And when I was back at home after graduate school, I started kind of thinking much more about place, and what it meant to me. And this was one of those works that kind of came out of that period. And part of what I was dealing with this was kind of that notion of, again, the unknown and seeing. I think as a painter, there's a certain sort of intellect, and you focus on really kind of developing these stories and these narratives, but also at the same time I'm very much interested in this notion of intuition. And when I was looking at when I started this painting, it was really kind of about this notion of trusting your feelings. What you see in the central part of the painting is this figure with no eyes, but he's holding a pair of binoculars that are supposedly there to help him see further than his physical eyesight. But yet, really, what's happening, his hand is reaching out. And it's really much more about this sensing, and kind of trusting your intuition. And of course, the landscape here is kind of in turmoil, and I have to say, as a painter, the landscape has been in my work for many years. I started out as a plein air painter at one time, working in New Mexico and Oklahoma in the Southwest. And then I started kind of dealing with this notion of mythic landscapes, and again, in a scape like this, I can fill it with things. And so what you see is that cedar tree in the back that's been sort of ravaged. You see three boughs of cedar. You see the tornado. You see that kind of archetype, that kind of sort of figure right here that he's reaching out to. And that's an early symbol of mine that I've worked with, and so it's really kind of an archetype for a human being, a person. One might even say a spirit, but it also deals with this notion of like a doorway, to me, and possibly a sarcophagus. I'll talk a little bit more about the symbolism a bit later too, but I will say that when I'm working with images, they don't have one set meaning. I like to deal with iconography that really has kind of a variety or a depth of different meanings depending on the context that it's being used. The other thing that you see up here is also the dove, and this sort of sun symbol. And I kind of look at those as being symbols that have this kind of connection to spirituality, the notion of Christian, but also native. And so this painting is really this kind of scape, where again, where places can kind of happen.
Norman, can you talk a little bit about so you said you were a plein air painter for a number of years. What prompted you to return to not just the landscape, but these very vast landscapes?
I
one of the defining features of your work?
I think one of the things is, and you'll see it a bit later, is that when I was in graduate school, I was dealing a lot with an imagined or a mythic landscape, and also I was dealing with this notion of being disconnected from place. So the notion of living in Illinois and painting up there while I was in graduate school, I was kind of inventing places.
Mm.
When I had returned home, that landscape that I was familiar with was right in front of me. And so this notion of being able to paint that scape was important. And also, I think one of the things that kind of deal with this relationship, to home is the history of place. Not everything's pretty.
Sure.
And I think among the Osages, like with many other tribal peoples, there's been struggles and obstacles that we as a nation have had to deal with, in relationship to our land. And so this landscape, is kind of an uneasy landscape, in a sense. There's a threat, there. I actually tend to kind of think of my paintings as sometimes warning paintings. That there's things kind of on the horizon, that you have to be conscious of or aware of. And I tend to tell a lot of stories, and even the notion of, I can remember growing up as a child before Doppler radar, we would, when the storms came, we stood out on the porch and we watched the sky, and we felt the temperature. And when the temperature changed and the clouds changed and the wind changed, then we sort of knew to go to the cellar, and that. And those are kind of experiences that I think have always been sort of important to me, as well. And so working with this, as I said, this is also a fairly large scale painting. I tend to either work really large or really small. And that kind of in between place is a little bit more difficult for me to paint. I'm going to move to another piece here. And this is going back, in time to graduate school. And I wanted to show at least one maybe example of an early painting, and this particular work is was from a period of my first year in the grad program, and I kind of abandoned the landscape. And at this point, what I'm doing is I'm sort of working with these expressionist paintings that are really a collection of symbols, and images that I was putting together, in these kind of really fast, kind of furious paintings, you might say. And what I was doing was trying to find a vocabulary, of symbols that I could work with. And part of the reason why I wanted to show this is that within this particular painting, I think there's a lot of images that you'll see sort of unfold in later works that become much more visible. And I like the notion of, when I'm painting, I like the notion of being in this unknown place, is that sometimes you get lost in a painting. You have no clue what's happening. But when you begin to reflect back on it, you start to see things that have importance. And likewise, there's some things that do kind of disappear, from that. But that's very much a part of how I sort of make work at that time. And so even in this piece, you're seeing this kind of, I'm going to use my cursor here real quick. You're seeing this funnel. You're seeing this sort of shape with a crucifix or a cross and these antlers. You begin to see a hammer. There's kind of a bird head right in here. And this funny little kind of bowl-like form that's happening here as well. And this is really just a means of sort of generating images, for the work. And I have to say, the other side of this is the physicality of paint and painting. of moving materials around. Painting is this process of it's adding and it's sort of destroying. It's an additive and subtractive sort of process, and then somewhere in between those two acts, what happens is things become visible in there, and that's part of what I begin to kind of look at, with this type of painting.
Norman, you've spoken to me about the importance of this particular work to what you're doing now, and sort of, do you consider this piece kind of genesis for a number of the symbols you use now, which I think is one of the trademarks of your painting, is this incredible lexicon of deeply meaningful symbols. And this is such a remarkable piece because it's so early, and yet it seems to have the seed for so much of your later work.
I would say it's become the genesis, as I've looked back.
Sure.
In the process of doing it, I had no clue as to where this was going, but it's obvious that within it, there's iconography that was important enough to be carried on, and I do think that that's one of the things that I've always dealt with, is this personal symbolism. And clearly, certain things are going to go and sort of move forward with you, when you're
Sure.
working. I do have to sort of say is that I don't think of them as having one, like I said earlier, one single meaning. Is that they change and they evolve as I grow.
Sure.
And as I age, but also the context of time, which kind of changes how I'm looking at some of these things. Yeah. Move on. Here's a painting called Collision of Heavenly Structures. And this was a work that was sort of worked on for about a year and a half. And it started off as a kind of a horizontal landscape, and eventually sort of shifted to something that was much more vertical. And I'm really intrigued with this notion of verticality, the sense of sky, the sense of earth, that type of balance, but also the movement. We think about this movement from sky, to earth, or even the notion of ascension, as well. And but this particular piece, is definitely rooted in this mythic landscape. And the size of it, 85 by 73, I always feel like, you paint at the scale, that shows the importance of what your subject is in your painting. This is kind of has an interesting history to it as a work too, because I had came across a diagram of an Osage creation story. And I remembered when I saw that diagram, I was really completely fascinated with it. But yet, I didn't completely understand all of the elements within that particular image. And I wanted to make a painting of it. And so I constructed the painting in this way, where it was kind of in a chaotic state, kind of a state of confusion, which kind of really reflected a bit of my understanding of it, of that creation story at that time. And it's important to sort of note too, is that I think that Osage stories and mythologies are actually really quite complex. There's just not one specific story. Is that those stories kind of changed and were shifted a bit, with the clan structure. This particular painting, what you see is the tree trunk, which was kind of a new symbol for me, in this work. You see, again, elements from that story: the sun, the moon, the river, the red bird, the stars, the Pleiades, but also you see this kind of Picasso-esque kind of angel figure. And then you see this sort of kind of figure that's like an animal, in a sense. That was actually a figure that came from a 12 Ferris cave in France, and was an old pictograph, from that cave. And so I sort of put that in there too as well. And it's also one of the first paintings that I started realizing that I was playing with this sort of conflict, this notion between sort of tribal and Western, too, as well. And that this painting, well, it's called Collision of Heavenly Structures, we're sort of seeing our story being kind of, I don't want to use the word, I mean, when I say fragmented, it's kind of reconstructing itself, in my thinking. And so as I said, this was a very, what I would call, important painting, for me. It's funny, I got to see it a few years ago at the Gilcrease Museum. And it was the first time I had seen it since about 1995. And I remembered walking up to it and looking at it. And much to my surprise, I had little pencil notations on the canvas where sometimes I would actually write and draw little stories within some of those open areas. So it was really this kind of desire to kind of fill the space. But again, you see a lot of new elements, like this red bird back here, the tree, that red oak leaf that was in that earlier painting, as well.
With a work like this, Norman, are you working with multiple audiences in mind? Are you considering, do you aim ever to share, say, information about Osage creation narratives with audiences beyond the tribal community, or is it more of a you create works with multiple audiences in mind, and whoever takes away what, that that's how the reception is?
I tend to think, I think as a painter, let me kind of clarify this. I think as a painter, I'm communicating to a large group of people with varying different backgrounds and experiences. As an artist, I want to create works that engage all people, into the act of looking and seeing and discovering. I think there are elements within my paintings that are clearly connected to Osage culture for Osage people.
Of course.
What I like to do is to code information. One of the things that's a real challenge for me, and I've found has been probably more of a challenge as I've got older, is that as an artist, we're expected to push boundaries and take chances. And it's kind of like the sky's the limit for subject matter.
Sure.
I tend to find that, coming from a tribal community, is that I also have to respect the values of that community as being a member of that. And so a lot of times what I find is that I actually do kind of self-censor some of the imagery that I work with, mainly symbols, and so I do that to kind of out of respect, really.
Sure.
But also, there are certain themes and things that I really want to paint. So what happens is that there becomes sort of hybrid symbols and images that are created, or the stories get really embedded in the work to where someone who's sort of open and knowledgeable will all of a sudden begin to see them.
Of course.
That's really how I kind of look at the audience, when I'm painting, and I'm even going to say more so the community.
And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about how these images are deeply personal visions that incorporate Osage mythology and beliefs, but ultimately are sort of personal statements.
Yeah, I mean, I have to kind of say, I think that's an important thing because, I mean, while I'm dealing with elements of Osage culture, I don't want to think of myself as a spokesperson for the whole Osage community, that these are very personal sort of explorations, and that helps me kind of sort of situate my place, within the community too as well. This is a piece also around that time called Balancing Act, and really it's kind of an important piece that, in the sense that I'm starting to deal much more with narrative. I'm starting to deal with this notion of duality, and as being an Osage, my father was Osage, my mother was Anglo. And so I've had this kind of duality within my life, but I also think of light and dark, sky and earth. You see that kind of archetype for the human being, right in the center of the painting. And it functions kind of as a doorway or a portal, for the most part, in here. And this was kind of an image that I was working with, that I could begin to kind of build an environment, or a mythic scape, around it. And you see roads, on the left-hand side. You see this kind of megaphone, and that megaphone keeps on recurring, in a lot of my work, and really it's kind of about the notion of calling. And when I say calling is that, it's kind of one of those things. I'm not for sure completely what the message is, but I like the notion of calling, and there's kind of a response there. Also, I will sort of say traveling has been a very important part of my life.
Mm.
You see these roads, and they also sort of feel like veins, they're floating and moving around the sky. So I do think of these very much as being sort of internal landscapes, and working with that. But as I said, this is kind of an early piece. You see that road that's sort of moving up to the sky. You see kind of a heaven, almost hell kind of situation, being sort of set up in here. And so that's a little bit more what this piece is about. It's kind of hard to see in the lower corner, but there's figures sort of dropping off into that kind of darkness there too as well. Move on to another image here. This is a painting called Redemption.
And for those of you joining us that are not familiar with the Horseman collection, this work is in our collection and was part of our digital exhibition, Traditions and Transformations. And I've spent a lot of time with this painting, and I'm always amazed how I still don't think I've seen every single detail that can be found in it. So I'm very excited to discuss this work with you, because there's just so much there.
I don't know, do you have any specific questions for this?
Well, do you think you could sort of, so there's so many symbols here. There's the elk, there's the megaphone, there's the black butterflies, which recur in your work and are now still part of your work. There's a number of birds depicted in the upper left corner, and then there's those amazing references to Native and Christian spirituality. And I guess I'm trying to think of where we can start. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit more about sort of these binaries of beliefs, or I don't even want to say binaries, but these dual beliefs, these Christian and Osage beliefs that continually recur in your work, and um, how you treat the depictions of those subjects, because I think they're quite unique to your paintings.
I think that kind of duality, that experience of both, just kind of permeates a lot of the work that I'm dealing with. Yeah. And it's sort of, my paintings kind of negotiate that, you might say, in many ways. But like in a work like this, you're seeing again that landscape. You see the elk. You see these kind of almost obscure relationships, like the three nails, the hand, the sun. The hand's almost in this position here, and even the title redemption. Kind of makes that kind of alludes to spirituality. In my mind, I tend to think of it as neither one or the other. I'm sort of navigating this too, in many different ways as well. Um, you've got this sort of storm that's kind of going on the megaphone. Um, the elk is sort of submerged, in here, but you also see that kind of ghost-like elk right in this little area here, as well. And I think in many ways, it's um, this painting really, in a sense, kind of hits that unknown place, for me. And as I said, I think sometimes, for me, a good painting exist in that place that I can't completely sort of articulate every element of it, that each time I look at it, I'm still kind of amazed, and I'm still questioning things. And this is one of those pieces. And I think the more successful paintings actually begin to do that for me, is that I will say I get stymied, and I'm kind of sitting here and I'm looking for the words. And I think that's kind of this kind of feeling that we get when we're dealing with this notion of the unknown. And clearly you see those kind of forms, like that kind of, again, the archetype. You see the Jarvik 7 artificial heart, in this painting. And at one time I was sort of using the Jarvik 7, artificial heart, in a lot of my work. And I remembered I was reading an article about Barney Clark. And of course, it's been years ago. And one of the things that he brought up, someone was interviewing him and asking, what was it like to have an artificial heart? And he described something. He said, well, of course, he was thankful, for having this extension of life. But I remembered something that really stuck with me. He said, it's like when I see my grandkids or see people, I said, I get excited. He said, but my heart just beats at the same beat. When we get excited, our heart beats faster.
Yeah.
And so there was that was kind of a disconnect there. But this particular piece, is very much, also very much a part of how I'm sort of fascinated with painting, the notion of thin washes, and to me, it's like the beginning of a painting is really exciting in the sense of all the possibilities. And as you're taking like a solvent-filled rag with pigment and you're pushing it across the canvas and you're drawing with it. I mean, you made a comment to me last week. You said, how much drawing do you do? I tend to draw with the paint more so than anything. In terms of doing sort of traditional drawings, I see drawing as an activity that's about problem solving, for the most part when I go into that. But this is sort of pushing the paint, the material around, waiting for something to happen. And then, you get these sort of more liberal, sort of thick applications of paint where you're sort of, building it around an area. And so the notion of thick and thin become really important. One of the things I'll sort of say, this last May, I had an opportunity to have dinner with the chair of my thesis committee. And he's quite an elderly man now. He's in his mid-80s. And he said something that was really profound to me. And he was kind of talking a little bit about my time as a grad student. And he made a comment. He said, you painted with an emotional depth. And he said, I value that emotional depth, much more someone that, and I'm going to put my words in here, much more than sort of someone who's just dealing with theory. And to me, when you're painting with that depth, you're kind of painting from your feet up.
Sure.
Feelings that your body, your relationship to the painting really, is communicated in the work. So to me, that kind of expressive mark making is extremely important. In the paintings. But no, yeah.
Because one of the things that I do love about this work, and sort of that relates to what you were saying about sort of the life of your relationship with a canvas, is with this piece in particular, you can sort of see every stage of development in the work. So you can absolutely see where you decided to intervene and keep moving the depth of field closer to the viewer, where you let the raw canvas stay visible, and at the same time there's this incredible play on actual illusionistic distance that you see you're working with, and that the complexity of that in conjunction with sort of the layers of canvas that you see is really remarkable in this work.
Mm-hmm. I tend, when I'm painting, I'm always thinking about this sort of space, the illusion of space, in a work. I do like, that kind of deep space and ambiguous space, also canvases where there's no real sort of hierarchy, that is sort of moving around in a way that it's looking at kind of relationships and how the pieces fit,
Sure.
And I think sometimes, and I sort of say this too, is like sometimes you create a space in a painting that all of a sudden you find yourself actually in that space, when you're working, and I think that's that kind of emotional connection, to a work that is important to me. Good paintings kind of transport you, for a moment, and that transformation process, I think, is incredible. Move on to another piece here. This is a piece called Eustace's New Suit. And again, it's one of those works that actually was a work I found really hard to paint. In many ways. And of course, you see this sort of same, kind of narrative that's going on. You see, light, dark, sky, earth, the Jarvik Sevens in here. This was interesting because this was done at a point in time when casinos were starting to become popular. And there's sort of a casino in that kind of right hand, sort of corner, that side in between the artificial heart and that sort of abyss. But the central image that you're seeing here is that drum, and I found that to be really kind of a difficult symbol to work with, in the sense that within Osage culture, particularly, that times we think of that drum as and sort of being addressed as the being, like grandfather. And to paint the drum that's broken, was really quite difficult. And this kind of goes back to that notion of the warning painting. What you see too is this sort of the figure behind it is dressed in this black suit and tie. You see the stag's head with the crucifix or cross, there, and that image came from symbolic of Saint Eustace, the patron saint of hunters. And I remembered I was in Europe at that time, and on the backside of this cathedral, there was a relief sculpture of the stag's head, with the crucifix. And I made a quick sketch of it, noted it, and came home and discovered that it was a symbol for Saint Eustace, the patron saint of hunters. And all of a sudden it made complete sense for Osage people, because I think Catholicism has been a very important part of Osage culture, as well as our own traditional religions, and it's still both are embraced today, and that was, I just thought it was an appropriate image, for that, because Osages, we were a hunting and gathering cultures. We were hunters. But also this painting is very much a warning painting. You see the arrows that are sort of being dropped off to the ground. You see the broken drum, here. And it's really about, kind of being cautious of accepting new things.
And the suit is kind of this it's a very slick sort of outfit that certainly you wouldn't expect to find on a feet.
Well, yeah, on a hunter or
or a hunter, of course.
But also I think, one of the things that's kind of interesting about Osages is that, I come from a generation, and I remember my father's generation, they were very well dressed. And they had a certain kind of slickness to them, and that's who they were. Yeah, are. But anyway, this is kind of a painting that sort of kind of explores, some of those themes, there. This is a painting that was a little bit later after that. Clearly the color palette is changing, quite a bit. It's getting a little bit more brash, in many ways. This is a piece just called Rebirth 2000. And it was kind of one of those paintings where I brought back the tree form, that came from that creation story. And yet in this version, you see that tree, it's sort of roots and its branches are kind of disconnected. For the most part, it's floating in this space between sky and earth. You also see this thunderbird sort of moving down this kind of road following that light. And very much this is kind of my painting about the notion of traveling. And, I think all of my work is really kind of dealing with this notion of traveling, this sort of ascension, this moving, or moving through these kind of different layers. In that original creation story, it talks about how, Zijo, the sky people, came down to earth, and found a place to live. But in this work, as I said, you see that kind of that tree form that's sort of sitting in the middle. Also, you're looking at this too. You've got that kind of animated cartoon-like blackbird, and then the opposite on the other side, you see this very sort of black and white kind of diagrammic image of the embryo of a snapping turtle. And one of the things that kind of caught my attention about this is that, it's like how and when we're painting is what we're thinking about and how we shift our thinking. And that sometimes what happens is that when we paint an image like that blackbird, in a sense, it becomes animated, it becomes expressionist, and there's a playful element to it, that begins to happen, and then it's like those first few steps that when you go from the palette to the canvas and where your head's at, your body's at, and then you make a mark, and then it conveys that kind of emotive element to it. But it is like, for instance, when I was painting those snapping turtles, it was very cut and dry. It was just really,
Sure.
and it had a very analytic feel to it.
Hmm.
And that kind of contrast that happens within a painting, really communicates the depth and the richness of how we think as human beings. But also at the same time, I think sometimes when I'm making an image, it feels very Western.
Sure,
You know,
sure.
that particular image, when you're looking at it, has its roots in science. That
Do you
diagram. Yes.
do you see the inclusion of that? I think a lot of viewers will see that extremely diagrammatic sort of scientific rendering of a snapping turtle and read that as a critique of colonialism or the colonialist project or even colonial ways of thinking. And it's interesting to me because the snapping turtle, as it ascends, returns, becomes less and less sort of developed. Unlike the
Mm.
tree, which ascends and becomes a full-grown tree with leaves, a sort of both of them sort of former versions of themselves. But I was just wondering, do you see the scientific image as a sort of as a critique?
No, I don't think it's particularly a critique as much as it's just a different way of thinking,
Hmm,
about uh, about about things.
sure.
And when I say that, let me kind of clarify too, a bit. This is that I think within Osage stories, and our mythology and our sayings, is that they were put in place because they helped us understand the world that we
Hmm,
live in. And that's why I'm intrigued with this notion of working with this iconography, but yet science also at the same time is about understanding the world that we live in. And yet
sure.
we're still constantly dealing with these unknowns, that are sort of a driving force for us to sort of to explore these sayings or create these sayings, to look at science and these diagrams. And that becomes very much, I think, a part of how I sort of look at, you know, this, and particularly when that came in, I was just really into the painting. I was just really fascinated with that sort of just the sheer black and whiteness of it. That there was nothing really kind of left to guess. It was just a diagram, there. But there's all these other elements, that too I'm playing with, the acorns, which are
Hmm,
about the rebirth of that red oak tree. And so these are, to me, I think, are very future oriented works. In a lot of my painting, I'm dealing with a lot of layering. And so I like the notion of how a painting sort of, functions in the past, the present, and possibly the future. And so beginning to kind of look at that. But really in many ways is that, when you look at, I think, and I'm going to say this from my perspective, is when you look at native storytelling, and these narratives, particularly the narratives that come from home, Osage, that they were put in place to help us understand the world that we live in. I've made the comment to you, I know in the past, is that I don't think, and I don't want to illustrate culture,
mhm,
that it's just simply about illustrating the past. I take liberties with a lot of the work that I deal with, because I'm interested in how this iconography, these narratives, these images, in a sense, transform, and in the process of transforming, they sort of become future oriented. And so
sure.
good paintings help me understand the world that I'm living in today. And it's not just an homage to the past.
Sure,
And
sure.
so that's when it becomes good, for me. move on to another piece here. This is it's a painting called Okitse, which in Osage means halfway, and it kind of refers to halfway between points or halfway between time. And I particularly am sort of fond of this particular piece in that it, to me, it's an Osage landscape. It's an Osage depiction of place. You know, it has these layers of history to them. You see that physical landscape of those green hills, you know, that water, and it's very much the landscape that I grew up in. But also you see this map that's being superimposed on it, and you see you know, the roads, the place names. I do a lot of work with maps, you know, in my print work primarily, but in this particular map, if you notice, the border between Kansas and Oklahoma has been sort of left out too, you know, so that marker, that border that reminds us of colonialism and removal is gone, you know, in this particular piece. But you also see the elk image standing, you know, in the front, and you know, in one of our Osage creation stories, you know, there's an element of this. I mean, the elk is a central figure here, and I'm not going to sort of recite the story completely, but the elk, you know, how I began to look at it is very much is sort of symbolic of land, you know, and in that story it talks about the elk sort of throwing himself down into the water, you know, and calling on the winds, and that gave us dry land to live on. And but also the elk, the antlers and the tines, you know, were symbolic of rivers and streams. You know, in that struggle, the hair of the elk got embedded in the mud, and that became grass, and different elements along the back became hills. You know, for us, and you can break that down even further. But what I sort of respond to this is this layering, you know, of representations of land and how that conveys, you know, kind of an Osage sense of place, you know, the physical land that we live in, you know, the history of colonialism with the map, you know, and again, the mythic, you know, element that are all sort of tied together, you know, in this particular work. You know, and two, it's like when you look at the maps, you know, and I'm always fascinated with maps, with how they orient us to place. You know, the maps have also, in cartography particularly, have been utilized to exclude Native peoples from their land. And so I tend, you know, to how would I say this? I don't always think of myself as a political painter. You know, or even what I might say an activist, you know, and but also I think for Native people, you can't paint the landscape without politics.
Of course.
To me, you know, it's like my works, you know, are very much political, you know, when I say that, but it's not at the forefront of what I'm painting about.
Sure.
It's something that simply just is there because it's there in my life, and that's how I begin to see that. And I like the term, you know, okitse, you know, halfway, you know, because, you know, as a person, I'm living in Kansas, which is also our traditional homeland, but I travel home, you know, on a regular basis. You know, as professional peoples, I think for a lot of us, you know, we, as much as we would like to live in our community, you know, jobs take us other places, and so there's always that movement back and forth.
And you know, you're with that work specifically, it's such a contemporary sense of place to that point. It's
Yeah,
not, I think, how it's certainly how legible as a depiction of place and the notion of place for viewers today, I don't think it would have been 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And I think it very much speaks to people's certainly your experience now, but I think a lot of people can relate to that halfway point, the notion of the halfway point today.
Well, I think we're dealing with that. I mean, I look at, my Osage relatives and my family, and I realize that we've lived on our land probably longer than most people.
Yeah.
Have a connection to home, because our community brings us back. And
Sure.
living in a world today where people are constantly moving and relocating, and you kind of lose that sense of place, or I shouldn't say that, or long term is
Yeah,
that place that you defined in different ways, and
absolutely.
here there's always this connection about coming back. It's like I drive down Highway 99, which is a 2-lane road from Kansas, and it's about a 4-hour drive to home. And to me, it's like an umbilical cord. I'm going through the tall grass, the Flint Hills, but I'm going home. And I know that road's taking me to that place. And move on to here. This is kind of, painting is always not always serious too. That sometimes you run into obstacles. This is a kind of a funny painting where a whole new discovery that happened that I wasn't even expecting. And I had painted on it for a while. It's got some influences from the printmaking where I'm dealing with a flatter space. And I'm still kind of negotiating this notion of deep illusionistic space. But that yellow sort of rectangular shape with the elk, and it really does begin to kind of flatten that particular space in the painting. But I remembered I had stalled on this painting and I couldn't figure out how to finish it. And then one day I had this extension cord that was laying on the floor that I was kind of too lazy to pick up, and I just kept on kicking it around out of the way. And one day I looked at it and I went, oh, and I made a quick drawing of it, sort of looped around on the floor. And I went, I'm going to put that in the painting. That's when I need to finish this work. And so that kind of orange power cord got placed in the painting, and I went, oh, now it's done. And then I started thinking about it, and I was going, power chord's about this notion of transferring power. Also chord versus the chord that's a sound. When it blows, it comes from this voice, the vocal cords, and you get that too as well. And that kind of opened up another sort of kind of level of discovery for me, in this particular work. And again, I talked a little bit about storms, and weather and tornadoes. There's the tornado siren, that's up there too as well. And so that's very much, I think, kind of, what this piece is kind of about, and so yeah.
What I love about this piece is when you told me the story about the power cord, I immediately imagined, well, what would it look like without that element of the work? And if you think of the painting without it, it's a much more stable, sort of calmer composition, but that orange in the foreground sort of throws everything into motion.
Well, it does that too. And I think within a painting, that's sometimes what happens. You have to have an element that activates the whole painting.
Absolutely.
It's like sometimes, it's like, I mean, I deal with this with students all the time. It's like, when is a painting done?
Yeah. Yep.
And I think as an artist, I still do with that notion too. It's like, when is it finished? And to me, it's like when all the parts fit, when you can't take anything away or you can't add anything. But sometimes what happens is that the piece or the element that you add to it activates the whole painting. And when you look at that, like the orange cord begins to activate all of the movement and the elements in the work, even that kind of strange red vein-like shape that's happening in there. And you kind of almost get this kind of pyramidal-like shape,
Mm-hmm.
in this particular work, but as I said, that's tending, that summed it up for me, in this work here. This is a painting called Interference in a Tiny Spot of Hope, and this was kind of a painting that came about from my sort of thinking about windmills, on the horizon. A number of years ago, a wind energy company decided that they were going to build windmills on our Osage land, and the tribe was not in favor of that, but they went ahead and built them anyway. And it's complex to talk about the whole history of land. Osages, we own the mineral rights, in our land, but we don't always own the surface rights, there. And so there's a lot of questions about, I think for many Osage people, we still look at our land as being a reservation. And the state of Oklahoma says it's just an Osage County, that we lost reservation status, when our land was allotted right before statehood. And so it's a very complicated issue. But the fact that the windmills were sort of built without, kind of the blessings of the tribe is a problem here. But also for me, traveling across that land, I was sort of all of a sudden I realized that the windmills are obstructing this relationship between earth and sky, that the blades in a sense cut through both. And so this was kind of a painting that was about that. You see the elk flipped upside down, in this work, and there's much more sort of turmoil.
And it's so this painting is so interesting to me because it sort of adds this nuance to something that I think a lot of people think consider just wholly a positive thing, and sort of speaks to the complexities of these environmental interventions that we, for the most part, don't think twice about very often. Oh, but I'm also interested in this work. You mentioned you adore the painter Tintoretto, and that seeing his work had a great impact on you. And I can't help but think of his painting St. Mark's Miracle, where there is a figure just floating up into this very active space. And there's definitely something of that spirit in this work.
Well, I have to admit, I spent a lot of time looking at Tintoretto and painters such as Veronese. I have a love of that particular kind of painting. The action, the movement, composition has always been something that's been really sort of important, to me, as well. I tend to kind of really try to look at diverse sort of influences there, for the most part. But I think, somewhere, particularly those painters, and particularly Tintoretto, seems to kind of stick with me, when I'm making a painting. So that kind of, and same way with Caravaggio. I mean, there's an element of drama.
Yes. Yeah.
It's important to me. And I think in many ways, when I'm making a painting, I'm also thinking about that. And this has, a little bit more of that feel than I think some of the other pieces that I've worked with. It's definitely slightly darker. The color is much richer in this work. It's starting to kind of, the landscape is also kind of breaking down a bit in here, and you're seeing, much more sort of drawn images and elements that sort of appear and kind of disappear. And I think that's one of the places that I'm sort of fascinated with going with the painting is getting to this point where painting is really more about discovering
Sure.
and creating situations where the transformation happens within the scape, for the most part. I'm going to move on. There's just a couple more here too. This is a piece called Dripping World, and it's a fairly recent painting, for the first part. And it's really kind of, COVID was an interesting period for me because I was starting to think about that notion of uncertainty, and I wasn't quite for sure, where things were going, in terms of the direction of my work. This was a piece that was kind of started at that beginning of that point in time, and I was actually kind of dealing much more with environmental issues.
Mm.
Looking at pipelines and that global warming. You see the dripping world. It's interesting. Even the red and white spheres were sort of depictions of molecules of water. So the micro macro kind of play, here. And as I said, this was really kind of much more of a piece about environmental kind of issues, and I'm still sorting that out to figure out how important and where that plays at, in my work. But this is one piece, and then I'm going to show one more work unless you have any questions, Anastasia.
No. I was gonna say real quick for people that are joining us from St. Louis or that have visited the city. This work was in the St. Louis Art Museum's bicentennial show, Art Along the Rivers. So this was one of the sort of opening images of that exhibition. That's a fantastic painting. And real quick, before you move on to your last slide, I know we're running a little bit over, but if anyone has questions, we'll take one or two questions at the end of our talk. So don't hesitate to enter them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
And I have to say, it was very much an honor to be a part of that exhibition too. Yeah, I think not only the museum's sort of desire to make that connection to the Osage, but as said, it was just quite a pleasure to be in the exhibit. This was a piece called Crying Elk, and kind of going back to COVID, the paintings all of a sudden started becoming a little bit, I think, more expressionist, and that sense of the unknown was very much going on in my head, at that time. And it was funny, there were certain sort of images that came back into the painting that hadn't been used in probably close to 20 years. And one of them was those black butterflies. And I've always sort of read them as, we think about butterflies as floating and moving around and sort of being happy, but these are sort of ominous in many ways. And so they become a part of it, but you're also, there's other elements that I went back to, is like, the sun, or like the moon, elements from those creation stories. And I felt like in a time of COVID and that uncertainty, I was kind of going back, trying to find things that were grounding me, to my own history of painting and my own sense of identity. But also at the same time, there were elements that were sort of about this kind of disconnect. You see that grid and that kind of like cage shape that's sort of floating around. The trees are all cut, for the most part. And it's really hard to see, but there's actually lots of little COVIDs floating around in the sky. And in that particular scapes, they're really quite small. This was one of those paintings that kind of tapped into an emotional level that I thought was important. And I hadn't really kind of felt in a while, but I'm also so fascinated with that feeling of uncertainty, that when you're not sure, sometimes you kind of make your best painting because you're engaged in trying to just figure out.
Yeah.
For me, it's
Yeah.
about figuring out, where I exist, where I'm, at. And that was very much of what this piece was about. And the teardrops simply became the last element, in there, that notion of crying. I've used tears in my paintings quite a bit, or those drops. And let me kind of clarify that, because I think one of the things and why I sort of work with them is that when you're happy, you cry. And when you're sad, you cry too.
Yeah.
But both of those are strong emotions. And when that happens, things are real.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when paintings, the good paintings, I will say, because I don't think everything hits that point, but the good paintings become real to me. That they're mythic scapes that embody this history, in place, but they're also scapes that allow me to sort of move forward in my life. And there's a kind of a realness that becomes very much important, to me. Yeah.
And it goes back to that frequently recurring notion of duality, the joy and the sorrow that kind of is often encapsulated in your work.
Exactly.
Listen, let me
Should I go to switch here?
you can stay in on the screen. I was gonna pull up, we're running a little bit over, so I have one question that I thought maybe we could
Okay.
Tackle and then let everyone off and onto their day. But one of our viewers says, "Hi Norman, it strikes me that your work feels aesthetically consistent over the decades of your career, even though the imagery differs. I'm curious if you perceive to be errors in your career, and if so, how you distinguish them, or if you've experienced your work unfolding more on a continuum."
Could you repeat that question? Sorry.
Sure, of course. The question essentially asks if do you perceive there to be eras in your career? I guess you could say specifically delineated parts of your work, or do you see your work as sort of unfolding on a continuum?
I tend to, it's complicated. I'm going to almost say the both, because one of the things that we didn't talk about today was my printmaking.
Sure. Yeah.
And so what happens is that there's certain elements of my work that are very compartmentalized, and I see them as like when I end a group of work, that's the end of that. And then I move on. I do think that the iconography that I'm working with is a continuum, that it evolves over a period of time. And even in sometimes the process of shifting from painting to printmaking, kind of changes the nature, of those symbols and images that I work with. So it's kind of a mix of the both. There are points in time where I feel like, the iconography doesn't have as much importance or meaning to me, and then I try to shed it, and I'm trying to find new sort of imagery to work with. I think that's kind of the place where I'm at today, with the work is that I'm sort of looking at where the next step is.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, everyone that joined us today. If you have any questions or you want to follow up with me or with Norman, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Horseman Foundation. info@thehorsemanfoundation.org. Will I'll certainly see that and pass that along to Norman if anyone wants to reach out. And thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. Thank you, and thank you so much, Norman, for joining us.
Good.
Take care.